I'm Cliff Ribner, and I want to talk to you today about an amazing thing that one of our founders came up with, James Monroe. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. He announced it in 1823 when we were still a pipsqueak nation compared to the rest of the world. But he knew in 1820, he was one of the founders, one of the people who participated in the original fighting of the American Revolution and in drafting our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He was a really great man, and he became president. He knew that because we had a free market, unlike Europe, which did not, there were parts of Europe, Britain in particular, had a partially free market, but the government there was much more intrusive than he ever envisioned. And he knew that if the government kept its hands out of businesses and out of the market, we would grow like, it would be unbelievable. We would become the richest and the most powerful nation in the world, and he was absolutely right. The Monroe Doctrine was an announcement, basically, to the rest of the world, particularly to Europe. That's where the great powers were at that time. The announcement was, keep your hands off South America. Don't colonize it, and also, just don't stick your nose into it. Get out of it. And it happened that the Spanish were still here. So were the Portuguese in Brazil. He knew that any intrusion into the entire New World would be considered an affront to us, that it would be getting into our backyard. It was forbidden. That announcement alone gave us power. And Theodore Roosevelt it's called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And what it was is that we had an interest in the governments in South America themselves to make sure that they didn't become dictatorships. And he was instrumental in having the Panama Canal, which revolutionized trade in the world, shipping. But a major reason for that was for our military to be able to go through there. He was interested in the politics of all Latin America. He was instrumental, I have to say, or at least as far as the PR part, in the Spanish-American War. He was a big hero. In that war, we defeated Spain and took the colonies away from Spain of Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. The Philippines obviously are completely independent, but we have always had an interest in all of those things. Puerto Rico and Guam are still territories of the United States. We don't treat them like colonies, and they're not really colonies. They're actually, in many ways, parts of America. They're not states. They don't have that status. But we had an interest in Cuba, even though we made it a protectorate in many ways. We still have Guantanamo Bay there. There was a statute passed that gave us an interest in Cuba. And two of our presidents abandoned the Monroe Doctrine. And it's done terrible harm both to America and to the Cubans in particular. It happened during the Eisenhower administration. In 1952, Batista staged a coup. Batista had been the elected president of Cuba until 1944, and then he lost an election. In 1952, as the election was approaching, he wanted to win, but he thought he couldn't win, but he managed to stage a military coup. So he had an illegitimate government there. Now, under the Roosevelt Corollary, Eisenhower should have intervened. He should have known that having an unstable government like that in Cuba risked communist takeover of that country. Even if he thought that the government that Batista ousted was leftist, they were not communist. Batista was not a communist either. He wasn't. He was just a corrupt guy who wanted to be president of Cuba. And he put a military dictatorship in there in 1952. And because it was an illegitimate government, it was guaranteed that there would be unrest in Cuba. And it was going to be inherently unstable. Eisenhower knew that there were communist revolutionaries who wanted their hands on anything they could get. And under the Monroe Doctrine, under the Roosevelt Corollary, the great thing that Teddy Roosevelt did was announce that we were interested in the governments in South America. We had a direct interest in those, that they should not become dictatorships. And that's exactly what happened there. And under that, Eisenhower should have said, we demand that you have elections. Because any government that came to power like that, first of all, it was going to be terrible to the people of Cuba. It was a military dictatorship. It wasn't a communist military dictatorship, but it was bad, and it was very corrupt, and everybody knew it. And Eisenhower did nothing. He did nothing to stop it. And meanwhile, all those years from 1952 to 1959, Castro was building up power in Cuba. And of course, he was a communist. Well, there were people in the State Department who thought, well, he's just a nationalist. It was nonsense. He was surrounded by communists. Everybody knew that all he wanted was massive power for himself. And that's what communism is. It's organized theft by the people who use its slogans to take over countries. And they use the slogans of free everything. We're going to have free housing, free stores, free food. Everything's going to be free. We're going to take from the rich and give to the poor. Robin Hoods. That's what the whole thing is. And it's all based on the lie that all businessmen are thieves anyway, so why shouldn't we be thieves also? Although they never say that they're thieves, but that's what they really are. It's legalized theft of everyone else's property. And during that time, Castro came to power in 1959. This is while Eisenhower was still president. He did nothing. He did absolutely nothing until right before Kennedy was about to take office in 1961. The CIA was plotting to have a covert war, but they wouldn't have needed to bother with that if they had simply nipped it in the bud, forced a real election in Cuba, and gotten rid of Castro somehow. Once he got in power, it was going to be a big problem. But the CIA came up with this brilliant idea of having some emigres from Cuba invade Cuba and take over from Castro. And unfortunately, these plans were done at the end of the Eisenhower administration, right before Kennedy came to power. Kennedy said, go ahead with it, but he gave them no air cover. He made it impossible for them to win, and it turned into what's known as the Bay of Pigs fiasco. It didn't have to be a fiasco, and this was catastrophic for the country in many ways. Khrushchev saw this and realized that Kennedy was weak. He didn't have the guts to use our power. And you have to understand, at that time, when Kennedy came to power, even though during the election he was accusing Nixon had been vice president under Eisenhower, of permitting a missile gap. Russia had gotten the bomb for years. From 1945 to 1948, we were the only ones in the world with nuclear weapons, and possessing nuclear weapons and having someone know that we could drop them was enough to make the Japanese commit absolute surrender. Complete surrender after Nagasaki. We didn't have to do anything after that because they knew we had them and that we would use them. So we had the credible use of the weapons. We were the only ones in the world who had them, and we were embarrassed by our power for some reason. We created the UN. That was what the strategic state of the world was. By the time Kennedy came to power, we had 31,000 nuclear weapons, overwhelmingly more than the Soviet Union ever had. They may have had a few hundred at that time. It was nothing. And they don't even know if theirs worked. The only reason they had them was they stole our technology through spies. But they never had the munitions capabilities that we had. During World War II, we were supplying them with most of their material that they were using to defeat the Germans. And that's the only place they fought. We gave them North Korea and North Vietnam because at Yalta and Potsdam, this is what our presidents did at a time when we really were the nuclear hegemon. We were in a position to dictate everything that every nation did because we had already exploded a weapon on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and shown that we could do it and that we had it and nobody else had it. And the possession of military technology that far beyond what anyone else in the world has made us the hegemon. We could have demanded that anything we wanted from any other country. We never had to fight the Vietnam War. We never had to fight the Korean War. And in fact, the reason the Korean War was fought at all was because under Truman, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, announced, he actually made this announcement that South Korea was outside of our protective zone, basically giving a green light to communist China to invade from North Korea, invade South Korea. It's just unbelievable. Words matter, and words can be power. The Monroe Doctrine was very powerful in keeping, just simply having that doctrine and the willingness to use it, kept foreign nations from expanding their colonial empires in America after that. All of South America eventually had liberation movements, and throughout the various colonizers who had mostly Spain, but also Portugal and Brazil. And we gave that the okay. We wanted that. We didn't want anyone and any other ideology messing around anywhere in South America and the Caribbean. And of course, Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. But anyway, we did nothing under Eisenhower to stop Castro becoming the dictator of that country. And he was just a military dictatorship. It was much, and of course, it was much more brutal and worse than Batista. Batista was so corrupt that there were lots of people who just wanted freedom who joined Castro. He was pretending he wasn't a communist, but anyone with a brain knew he was. The CIA surely knew he was a communist. They couldn't have been that stupid. But Eisenhower did nothing. And then Kennedy made that terrible mistake with the Bay of Pigs of refusing to give air cover. He refused, so that it was guaranteed that those emigres would lose and be slaughtered. They were just slaughtered. And nobody else ever made an attempt against Cuba. And what that did was it showed Khrushchev that Kennedy was basically a coward. He was embarrassed by our nuclear superiority. And at that time, we had nuclear weapons in Turkey, very close to the Soviet Union. So in addition to having 25,000 nuclear weapons at that time, and we had 31,000 at the height of the Vietnam War. That's another war we didn't need to fight because we could have used our own power. Kennedy made a deal with Khrushchev. The reason Khrushchev put those nuclear weapons into Cuba in violation of the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary was because of what Kennedy had done with the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy had made himself look like a fool. And Khrushchev knew that he could do that and use those weapons as a bargaining chip to get Kennedy to take our nuclear weapons out of Turkey. And Kennedy was so interested in PR. All he cared about was being popular. I think he was probably a real patriot, but he was weak. He had all kinds of physical problems that were undisclosed. The press did not report anything true about Kennedy the whole time he was there. He made a deal with Khrushchev. He's portrayed as this great cold warrior of the way he handled Khrushchev. We had overwhelming nuclear strength. There was no way the Russians could attack us with nuclear weapons and not be completely annihilated. They had just a few hundred nukes, and he put a few into Cuba, and he got Kennedy to agree to two things, which Kennedy should never have agreed to. He got Kennedy to agree to take the weapons out of Turkey, and that was the real reason Khrushchev did that. He wanted those weapons out of Turkey because they were right next to Russia. And he got Kennedy to renounce the Monroe Doctrine. It's incredible. This was renouncing a doctrine which gave us power because we had all the machinery needed to make weapons. And that's how you win wars. That and morale. We were the freest nation in the world. And that's why no one could defeat us. And he was simply unwilling to use the power. And of course, in Vietnam, he guaranteed that we would lose the Vietnam War. By refusing, he was told by the CIA that the North Vietnamese were infiltrating South Vietnam using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the North Vietnamese army. And that's exactly what they were doing. They were coming into villages and terrifying the villagers, and they weren't wearing uniforms. So by the time we got around to actually fighting that war, it was an impossible situation. We won all the real battles. Nobody could touch us on the battlefield. But we had this very difficult situation that all the villages had been infiltrated by the North Vietnamese army. They called them the Viet Cong. But it turned it into the most difficult type of war. But neither Kennedy nor Johnson were ever willing to threaten. The real supporters of North Vietnam could not have fought that war without the support of the Soviet Union and Communist China. They couldn't have done it. They didn't have the economic wherewithal because their economy was a disaster. That's what happens under communism. And all that any of our presidents ever had to do was use our power. And in fact, during the Cold War, I remember as a kid, we used to have these drills there were bomb shelters in the schools. We would have these drills where we ducked under our desk because they terrified us. They made the whole country terrified that the Russians could attack us with nuclear weapons. The reality was they could never have done that to us. There was no reason to frighten the American people. We could have forced the Soviet Union to give up their nuclear weapons. They never had the capability of matching our ability to manufacture them. That's why we were able to have 31,000 by the time Johnson became president. Well, when Kennedy became president, we had 25,000. Soviets had, Chinese had, communists had nothing. We permitted China to become communist. That couldn't have happened without the support of the Soviet Union. We could have threatened credibly because we had the credibility because of what we had done at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We could have threatened the use of nuclear weapons and prevented communist China from becoming communist at all. And we could have won the Korean War without losing 50,000 Americans. It was a terrible war. And in Vietnam, the same thing. And that's not even counting all the wounding and the terrible damage those wars did to the American public. The American public were put through a depression that was caused by the Fed and World War II, in which basically people were unable to buy most of the things they wanted, in addition to losing hundreds of thousands of Americans in that war. It was a terrible thing. One of the reasons Eisenhower was so popular was the one time we weren't at war. And that alone was a huge burden taken off the American people. But while he was president, the highest income tax bracket was 91%. And even though he was a Republican, he never even offered any tax cut. He wanted it like that. It was terrible. And when the income tax rate is that high, if you're late on a payment, you can never catch up. There was a famous comedian named Ernie Kovacs who got some bad tax advice, so he owed money. But because they add penalties and interest when you don't pay on time, it ends up being over 100% of your income if you're in that bracket. And that's what happened to him, where he literally could never have paid the taxes that he owed. And he basically, it killed him. He died of a heart attack. But that's the kind of stuff that Eisenhower was willing to put the American people through. And Jack Kennedy, with no doubt all the best intentions, just really wanted to be popular. Part of the deal was the Soviets didn't tell anybody that we took the missiles out of Turkey. And there was the fact that we had renounced the Monroe Doctrine was basically kept under the table. So the only people who knew about what Kennedy had done were the enemy. He made sure the American people didn't know, and they didn't find out until decades later. This is just some of the ways that Eisenhower and Kennedy sold us out. Eisenhower did another terrible thing, guaranteeing problems in the Middle East, when he refused to support the French and the British and Israel when Nasser, who was a communist in Egypt, took over the Suez Canal. This was a major strategic thing. And it also happened to be property owned by the French and the English. Eisenhower did nothing. In fact, he turned his back on our enemies at the UN. He went with the enemy against our friends. I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you like this video. Please indicate that you like it if you did, and watch my other videos, and go to my website, cliffordribner.com, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.